Okay, this week we are going to look at women in Rome. And what I have here is a quote from a Roman historian, Ronald Syme, written quite a few years ago. I'll just read this to you as you read along. Women have their uses for historians. They offer relief from warfare, legislation, and history of ideas, and they enrich the central theme of social history. Ladies of rank are a seductive topic. I do want to point out that this was written quite a while ago, and if you look at any history books written before, say, 1960, this will definitely be the case. You find very wealthy women showing up in the histories of Rome and doing just what Ronald Syme says. Now, if you look at history books written after this, hopefully this is not the case. And I do sort of see the irony of having a whole lecture just on women, but I want to make sure that you understand part of the reason why we haven't really talked about women is because of what Amy Richland has to say in this quote here, where it's difficult to talk about women and slaves and working people, other marginalized groups, as she says here, because they just don't show up in the text. It's very rare to find women being talked about, and it's partly because, as you see at the very last part of this quote, when they do appear, they're so clearly figments of an elite male author's imagination. So there are lots of issues with talking about women within the context of Roman history, especially in the Roman Republic, because of these very reasons. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about quite a few things. I have a number of sources where I've pulled information on this. One is Gillian Clarke's Roman Women. Now, this is not an article that I ask you to read for this class. You can certainly look this up on JSTOR. Pretty easy to find. And I hope that you've already read the other two articles I've given you. I do want to start off sort of talking about infants and then free women, slave women, and so on, at least a little bit of what we know. Now, just remember what I talked about at the very beginning of this lecture. A lot of what we have in the literature about Roman women comes from Roman men, and they have a very specific reason for writing about women. So you just have to be careful not to totally accept what they have to say. And that's why I've given you those two articles, that the articles go pretty deep into what possibly women were actually doing. We do know, though, that both in Greek culture and in Roman culture during this period, that children and girls in particular can be exposed. And what that means is essentially putting them out and then let nature kill them. That's really what exposure is. And there were a couple of reasons why Roman fathers in particular would have a hand in this, partly because if they were considered to be, as this quote by Dionysius of Halicarnassus says, they're either maimed or they have some type of what they call they're monstrous, some type of defect that wasn't considered normal for Roman norms. And so what that means is any child like that, and again, especially girls, could be set out in the wild, and then nature would take its course to kill these children. Now, of course, you're probably wondering, how on earth could people do this? In the Greek world, we're fortunate to have some plays that talk about women having to deal with exposing their children and the death of children and so on. There are some examples of this in Roman literature, but in terms of like how women would cope with carrying a child and then giving birth and then having the baby killed, at least for upper class women, they may not have seen the baby. It may have been taken from them before they had a chance to see it. Lower class women certainly did see their babies. And then, of course, if they're taken away, then you have to think about how they actually had to deal with all of this in terms of exposure. Another difficult part about having children in general is, of course, feeding them. Pliny the Younger here, who is writing in a time period after our course will end in the 100s AD, says there are great rewards to encourage the rich to rear their children, and great penalties if they're not. What he's talking about is laws that encourage people to have large families. And then he states here, you know, the only way that poor people could feed their children is through the goodness, what he calls the goodness of the princeps, or the emperor. And what he's really meaning here is that starting in Rome during our period, the Republican period, the Roman leaders would pass out free bread to the people, and then this is one way that the poor could actually feed their children, so that's what he's referring to here. We do find in general now, it's hard to say exactly if this is true, but there seems to be fewer women or fewer girls in Roman families. There's a couple of reasons for this, and I've put this here. Women died in childbirth. Very common thing. It's still probably one of the most dangerous periods in a woman's life is to give birth. We have hospitals and medicine and so on. They did not have that in the ancient world. We also know that abortion was practiced. Now, you wouldn't know whether the child is a boy or a girl, but this could be one of the reasons why you have fewer women, is because if abortion is practiced, it was very dangerous, and then people could certainly die in the process. In terms of naming children, there's sort of an interesting concept in Roman society that girls are not necessarily given their own names. They're taken what's referred to as the feminine form of their father's family name. So this means sisters, aunts, cousins, any female relation would carry the same type of name. In terms of slave girls, so slavery we haven't really talked about yet in particular. We'll talk about it in a few weeks. It's a pretty horrific system, but it was a common system in the Roman period. Of course, what would normally happen is if a woman who was a slave gave birth to children, these children were sometimes taken away right away, which is why I put up here they rarely see their families. Girls in particular would have certain duties as a slave girl, and right now I'm being very general about this. You'd have maids, you would have girls that would be in charge of these particular things I put up here. Hairdressing, cooking, cleaning. You also, sadly enough, have girls who were put into brothels or places where men would come in and pay to have sex with them. And I've listed a few of the things that could possibly happen to Roman slave girls. Some people could be freed. This is something called manumission. And they would be referred to as freed women as opposed to freed men. These were just slaves who were freed for various reasons. Now, what could these people do? Well, you could not really move up in your social class and marry into an upper class wealthy family if you are a freed woman. So what most women end up doing is marrying someone in their own social class, which would be a freed man or freedman. You would get sort of the same type of jobs, if that's how you want to describe it. Spinning, weaving, sewing, child rearing. Another sort of position you could have as a freed woman is something called a concubina. And this is, in one of the articles I had you read, she would be referred to as a girlfriend, but not in the modern sense of a girlfriend. It's a woman who has been paid for sex and paid for other services, and not the wife of somebody. She could also be a prostitute, or as one of the articles I had you read, a sex worker, a woman who is paid for sex. So those are a few things that she could certainly do. And just remember, I'm being very general here, pulling this information from a variety of sources, mostly Roman literature. Free poor girls were treated much like their slave girl counterparts, meaning they had the same positions, except for being put into a brothel and so on. Free wealthy girls. Now, of course, as you probably have guessed, if you're coming from a wealthy family, your social status is much higher, and you wouldn't be doing the same things, certainly as a poor slave girl, or as a poor free girl. These wealthy free girls were taught to, as I put here, run the house, meaning the financial aspects, handling the household, handling how you deal with servants, and so on. There wasn't a lot of physical work that they did. However, they did do weaving and sewing. If you remember, towards the beginning of the class, we talked about Lucretia, the myth of Lucretia, and how that sort of has affected Roman society, in particular women. She was considered to be the perfect example of an excellent wife because she was found at home at night weaving and sewing and taking care of her household. Normally wealthy free girls, when they were old enough to have children, they didn't raise their own children. They had servants do that for them. Education, that's a good thing to think about. Were they educated? Like most societies in the ancient world, if you're coming from a wealthy family, there's a good chance that you would be educated. What you need to also think about is if you are poor and for some reason, if your father or your mother could read or write, more than likely they taught this to the children as part of handing down some information that might be useful for their lives later. So I don't want you to think that just wealthy people taught their kids to read. It probably was passed down if the poor parents were lucky enough to be able to read and write. In terms of wealthy, some of the girls were taught reading, writing, math skills, because that's something you need to run a household. And as I put here, sometimes, what I should have put, poor fathers sometimes taught their daughters other things that were outside of the norm. And this is also the case for wealthy fathers.